The morning sun peeked through the clouds as Margaret Wilson slowly made her way down Main Street. At 78, she didn't move as quickly as she once did. Her bones ached from the cold spring air, but today nothing could dampen her spirits. She clutched her purse tightly against her flowered dress, feeling the small velvet pouch inside that held her mother's sapphire brooch. "Just 2 more blocks," she whispered to herself, pausing to catch her breath near the bakery, where the smell of fresh bread made her smile. She and Robert had come here every Sunday for 60 years, ever since they were newlyweds with nothing but dreams and a tiny apartment above the hardware store. Margaret glanced at her reflection in the bakery window. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and she'd put on her good pearl earrings today. This was a special trip after all. 60 years of marriage didn't happen every day. As she continued walking, her mind drifted back to when she first received the sapphire brooch. Her mother had pressed it into her hands just days before passing away. "Something blue for when you marry that Robert boy," her mother had said with a knowing smile. Margaret had worn it pinned to her simple white dress when they'd said their vows in the small-town church. The bell above the door of Franklin's jewelry chimed softly as Margaret stepped inside. The shop was empty except for old Mr. Franklin himself, who looked up from behind the counter with a warm smile. "Mrs. Wilson, what brings you in today?" he asked, adjusting his glasses. Margaret approached the glass counter slowly, her hand trembling slightly as she opened her purse. "Hello, George," she said, her voice carrying the gentle weight of her years. "I've come about something special for Robert." She carefully removed the velvet pouch and opened it, revealing the sapphire brooch that glittered even in the soft light of the shop. "It was my mother's," she explained, though George Franklin had heard the story many times over the decades. "Our anniversary is next month, 60 years. Her eyes crinkled at the corners as she smiled. "I want to have the stone reset into cufflinks for Robert. He always admired this brooch, you know," said the blue reminded him of the sky on the day we met at the county fair. George took the brooch carefully, examining it through his jeweler's loupe. "Beautiful stone, Margaret. Still as clear as the day your mother brought it in to be cleaned back in 52. Margaret nodded, then lowered her voice. "Robert's hands. They shake so badly now from his condition. He can't button his own shirts anymore. But he still insists on wearing a nice shirt every Sunday for church. Says there's no reason to let standards slip just because he's old." She smiled softly. "I help him with the buttons now, but I thought cufflinks might be easier. Special ones." George nodded understanding. "We can certainly do that. I have some lovely settings that would work beautifully." "How much would it cost?" Margaret asked, her fingers nervously playing with the worn edge of her purse. When George told her the price, Margaret's face fell slightly. On their fixed income, with Robert's medications taking so much each month, it was more than she'd expected. But she straightened her shoulders and nodded firmly. "Can I put down a deposit and pay the rest in installments?" she asked, already opening her purse to the separate compartment where she kept her rainy day money, saved dollar by dollar from her grocery budget over the past year. "Of course, Margaret," George said kindly. "For you and Robert, anything." As Margaret began counting out crisp $20 bills on the glass counter, her fingers moved slowly but deliberately. Each bill represented small sacrifices: the hair appointments she'd skipped, the new sweater she didn't buy, the cheaper coffee she'd switched to. But she didn't mind. The thought of Robert's face when he opened the small box on their anniversary made everything worthwhile. "He gave me 60 years, she said quietly, more to herself than to George. "These cufflinks are just a small thank you." The bell above the door chimed again, but Margaret didn't look up, focused on counting out her hard-saved money, unaware that the person who had just walked in would change everything. The soft chime of the bell faded as the door swung closed. Margaret didn't look up right away, her fingers still moving carefully across the worn bills on the counter. "Just need to count this once more," she murmured, starting over. Her Social Security check wouldn't arrive for another week, and she needed to be sure she had enough left for groceries. George Franklin's expression changed suddenly. His eyes widened behind his glasses, and he straightened his posture in a way Margaret hadn't seen in years. "Good afternoon," came a deep, gentle voice from somewhere behind her. Margaret glanced over her shoulder, then quickly turned back to her money. She'd seen enough movies with her grandchildren to recognize the tall man, who now stood politely waiting his turn. His dark hair fell to his shoulders, and he wore a simple black jacket over a plain t-shirt. Nothing flashy or attention-seeking, just like she'd heard about him. "I'll be with you in just a moment, Mr. Reeves," George said, his voice pitched slightly higher than normal. Keanu Reeves. Margaret had seen that movie about the bus that couldn't slow down. Robert had enjoyed it too, though he'd fallen asleep before the ending. That had been back when he could still follow movie plots without getting confused. "No rush at all," Keanu replied. "Please take your time." Margaret felt suddenly self-conscious about how long she was taking. Her arthritis made counting money slower these days. She tried to hurry, dropping a $20 bill in the process. Before she could bend to retrieve it, Keanu had already stooped down and picked it up. "Here you go, ma'am," he said, holding it out to her with a gentle smile that reached his eyes. "Thank you, young man," Margaret said, accepting the bill. Up close, she noticed how kind his eyes were. Tired perhaps, but genuine. Not what you'd expect from someone famous. "I'm sorry to hold you up." "You're not holding me up at all," he assured her. "I just came to pick up a watch." He stepped back respectfully, giving her space to finish her transaction. George cleared his throat. "So that will be $80 as your deposit, Margaret, and we can work out a payment plan for the rest. It'll take about 2 weeks to reset the stone." Margaret nodded, sliding the money across the counter. "That works fine, George. Robert's anniversary gift will be worth every penny." She gathered her purse, noticing her hands were trembling slightly, whether from age or the unexpected presence of a movie star, she wasn't sure. As George wrote up a receipt, Keanu stepped closer to examine a display case of watches. Margaret couldn't help but notice he seemed genuinely interested in her conversation, not impatient or dismissive as she might have expected. 60 years of marriage deserves something special, George commented as he handed Margaret her receipt. 60 years? Keanu asked, genuine surprise and admiration in his voice. "That's remarkable." Margaret smiled, a touch of pride warming her face. "Next month. We were just kids when we started out. I was 18 and Robert was 20. Everyone said we were too young, that it wouldn't last." She chuckled softly. "We proved them wrong." "May I ask what you're having made?" Keanu inquired, his interest appearing sincere. Margaret hesitated only briefly before opening her purse to show him the empty velvet pouch. "Cufflinks from my mother's sapphire brooch. Robert always loved this old thing. His hands shake too badly now to manage buttons, but he still likes to dress nicely for church and doctor appointments." She wasn't sure why she was telling this famous stranger such personal details. Perhaps it was the way he listened, really listened, as if her story mattered as much as any Hollywood script. "The stone matches his eyes," she added, then laughed softly. "Or at least it used to. Everything fades a bit with time, I suppose, but not the things that matter." Keanu nodded, a shadow of something, understanding, perhaps, or his own memories, passing across his face. "George," he said, turning to the shopkeeper while reaching for his wallet, "I'd like to pay for this lady's order in full." Margaret's mouth fell open slightly. "Oh no, I couldn't possibly." "Please," Keanu said, his voice soft but certain. "It would be my honor." Margaret clutched her purse tighter, a complex mixture of emotions washing over her weathered face. Pride battled with practicality as she stood there, caught between refusing his generosity and accepting help that would ease her budget considerably. The bell above the door chimed again as another customer entered, unaware of the moment unfolding inside the small jewelry shop, a moment that was about to change more lives than one. The new customer, a young woman with a baby stroller, spotted Keanu and froze in the doorway. Her eyes widened and she fumbled for her phone. George quickly flipped the shop sign to closed and gently guided her back outside with a whispered promise of a special discount if she returned tomorrow. Margaret hadn't noticed this small drama. She was still trying to process Keanu's offer, her weathered hands clutching her purse straps tightly. "I appreciate your kindness, Mr. Reeves, but I can't accept that," she said firmly. "Robert and I have always paid our own way, 60 years of it." Keanu nodded, respecting her pride. "I understand. My grandmother was the same way." He paused, then added thoughtfully, "Would you mind telling me more about Robert? About your 60 years together?" Something in his voice, a genuine curiosity, maybe even a touch of loneliness, made Margaret soften. George excused himself to the back room, mentioning paperwork, tactfully giving them privacy. Well, Margaret began, settling onto the small velvet stool by the counter. Robert was the handsomest boy in Pine Creek. He worked at his father's garage back then. Always had grease under his fingernails, no matter how much he scrubbed. She smiled at the memory. He used to bring me wildflowers every Sunday, picked from the fields behind the church. Keanu leaned against the counter, listening intently as Margaret continued. We didn't have much when we started out. Lived in a trailer for the first 3 years. Robert worked 2 jobs so I could finish nursing school. Her eyes grew distant with memory. When I got pregnant with our first baby, he built a crib from scrap wood. Sanded it so smooth you think it came from the finest furniture store. Keanu smiled. He sounds like a remarkable man. Oh, he had his moments, Margaret chuckled. Stubborn as a mule when he thinks he's right. Nearly drove me crazy during those early years. Once, he tried to fix our leaky roof himself instead of calling a professional. Ended up with a broken arm and a roof that leaked worse than before. They'd both laughed, and Margaret was surprised at how easy it felt talking to this famous stranger. There was something about him that reminded her of Robert in his younger days, a quiet thoughtfulness, a gentle strength. Robert got sick 5 years ago, she continued, her voice softening. Parkinson's. It's been hard watching him struggle with things that used to be so easy. But you know what he said to me last week? Her eyes grew misty. He said, Maggie, these have been the best 5 years of my life because I get to spend all day, every day with you. Keanu was quiet for a moment. That's what love really is, isn't it? Being together through the hard parts and still finding joy. Margaret nodded. The doctor says he probably has a couple more years, if we're lucky. That's why this anniversary means so much. I want him to have something special to remind him of us, of our story. She opened her wallet and carefully pulled out a faded photograph. A young couple standing in front of a Christmas tree, the woman wearing the sapphire brooch on her sweater. This was our first Christmas after we got married. My mother had just passed, and I wore her brooch every day that year. Robert always said the blue in that stone matched the sky on the day we met. Keanu studied the photo, noticing the way young Robert looked at his wife, with the same devotion Margaret's eyes still held 60 years later. Please, he said quietly, let me do this. Not because you need charity, but because stories like yours should be honored. My own grandparents were married for 52 years before my grandfather passed. I'd give anything to do something like this for them now. Margaret looked at him thoughtfully, seeing beyond the famous face to the person underneath, someone who understood what really mattered. Robert wouldn't like it, she said slowly, then a small smile crossed her face. But I won't tell him if you won't. Keanu's face brightened with a genuine smile. It'll be our secret. As George returned from the back room, Margaret made a decision that would lead to something neither she nor Keanu could have anticipated, the beginning of an unexpected friendship that would touch not just their lives, but many others. After George finished the paperwork for the cufflinks, he smiled at them both. The order is all set. They'll be ready in 2 weeks, just in time for your anniversary, Margaret. Keanu glanced at his watch. Do you have time for a cup of coffee? There's a small cafe next door. I'd love to hear more about you and Robert. Margaret hesitated. She'd planned to catch the 3:15 bus home. Robert would be waiting, and his home nurse left at 4:00. But something about this moment felt important, like a page turning in a book she hadn't known she was reading. I suppose I could stay for a little while, she decided. Robert's watching his Western shows this afternoon. He probably won't even notice I'm running late. Outside, the spring air had warmed. Margaret moved slowly, her cane tapping against the sidewalk. Keanu matched his pace to hers without comment, showing no sign of impatience. The cafe was nearly empty. The young waitress did a double take when they walked in, but Keanu's polite smile and quiet demeanor seemed to put her at ease. They settled into a corner booth away from the windows. Just a regular coffee for me, Margaret told the waitress. Black, with 1 sugar. The same, Keanu said, and maybe some of those cookies in the display case. When the waitress left, Margaret looked around the cafe. Robert and I had our first date in a place like this, she said. Not this one, but similar. A little diner on Cherry Street that's long gone now. He spilled his milkshake all over his new shirt. He was so embarrassed he could hardly speak for the rest of the night. Keanu laughed softly. Did you give him a second chance after that? Oh, yes. He showed up at my door the next day with flowers and his shirt still wet from trying to wash out the stain. Margaret's eyes twinkled. He was wearing his father's shirt, which was 2 sizes too big. He looked like a little boy playing dress-up. The coffee arrived, and Margaret wrapped her thin fingers around the warm mug. You know, she said thoughtfully, people always ask the secret to staying married so long. They expect some profound answer. She took a small sip. The truth is, there were days I couldn't stand him. Times I packed a bag, ready to leave, and I'm sure he felt the same about me. Keanu nodded, listening intently. But we made a promise. Margaret's voice grew stronger. Not just on our wedding day, but every day after. A promise to try again tomorrow. That's the real secret, knowing that love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice you make every morning when you wake up. That's beautiful, Keanu said quietly. Margaret studied him for a moment. Have you ever been married, Mr. Reeves? A shadow seemed to pass over his face. No. I've had relationships, but nothing that lasted. It's not for everyone, Margaret said kindly. Robert's brother never married. Traveled the world instead, had adventures. Seemed perfectly happy with his choices. Keanu nodded, a small smile returning to his face. He reached for a cookie. These remind me of the ones my grandmother used to make. She raised me for much of my childhood. Was she the one married for 52 years? Margaret asked. Yes, my grandfather worked on the railroad. Every day when his train would come in, no matter the weather, she'd be waiting at the station. His expression grew distant. Even in her last years, when dementia had taken most of her memories, she still looked toward the sound of trains. Some things are too deep to forget. Margaret reached across the table and patted his hand, an instinctive gesture of comfort from decades of nursing. That's why your gift means so much. Not the money, but that you understand what these cufflinks represent. As they continued talking, the cafe began to fill with the after-work crowd. A few people recognized Keanu, trying to take discreet photos. He ignored them, keeping his attention fully on Margaret's stories. When she checked her watch and gasped at the time, Keanu immediately signaled for the check. Robert will be wondering where I am, she said, gathering her purse. The nurse leaves at 4, and he gets anxious when he's alone too long. Let me drive you home, Keanu offered. My car's just around the corner. Margaret looked at him, this famous stranger who somehow didn't feel like a stranger anymore. That would be nice, she said. And perhaps, would you like to meet Robert? He doesn't have many visitors these days. The invitation hung in the air between them, simple words that would lead to something neither of them could have anticipated. Keanu's car was nothing like Margaret expected. No flashy sports car or luxury vehicle, just a sensible black sedan, clean but clearly well used. He opened the passenger door for her, making sure she was settled before closing it gently. It's the third house on Maple Street, Margaret directed as they pulled away from the curb. The blue one with the white shutters. Robert painted those shutters every spring for 40 years. She sighed. My son does it now. As they drove, Margaret pointed out landmarks of her life. The elementary school where she'd volunteered after retiring from nursing, the park where she and Robert had walked every Sunday until his diagnosis, the church where they'd said their vows 6 decades earlier. This town has changed so much, she mused, but I still see it as it was. That's how memory works, Keanu said quietly. Places become more than buildings. They're containers for pieces of our lives. Margaret looked at him with surprise. That's exactly it. You know, for a movie star, you're quite thoughtful. Keanu laughed, a genuine sound that filled the car. Don't believe everything you see in movies. Most of us are just ordinary people with unusual jobs. They turned onto Maple Street, lined with modest homes built in the 1950s. Gardens were starting to bloom, splashes of color against weathered siding and concrete porches. That's ours, Margaret said, pointing to a small blue house with a wheelchair ramp leading to the front door. The lawn was neatly trimmed, and clay pots of geraniums flanked the steps. As Keanu parked, Margaret suddenly looked nervous. I should warn you about Robert. The Parkinson's affects his speech sometimes. You might need to be patient. Take all the time we need, Keanu assured her. I'm in no rush. They walked up the ramp together, Margaret using her key to unlock the door. Robert? I'm home, she called out as they entered. And I've brought someone with me. The living room was modest but comfortable, worn furniture, knitted blankets, walls covered with family photos. A silver-haired man sat in a recliner, his thin frame dwarfed by a blue cardigan. His hands trembled visibly, even at rest. "You're late, Maggie," he said, his voice somewhat slurred but warm with affection. "Was worried about." He stopped mid-sentence, noticing Keanu standing behind his wife. Margaret moved to his side, touching his shoulder gently. "Robert, this is Mr. Keanu Reeves. I met him at the jewelry store today." Robert's eyes widened slightly, recognizing the name if not immediately the face. "The movie fella? The one with the bus?" Keanu smiled, stepping forward to offer his hand. "That's right, sir. It's an honor to meet you." Robert's handshake was weak, his hand trembling, but his grip was determined. "Don't know what you're doing in our living room, but welcome anyway." "I hope I'm not intruding," Keanu said, taking a seat on the sofa across from Robert when Margaret gestured for him to sit. "Your wife has been telling me about your life together. 60 years is quite an achievement." "Best 60 years anyone could ask for," Robert said, his eyes moving to Margaret with such tenderness that Keanu had to look away, feeling he was witnessing something deeply private. Margaret busied herself in the kitchen, returning with a tray of iced tea. Her hands shook slightly as she set it down, and Keanu noticed how Robert watched her with concern despite his own tremors. "Let me help," Keanu offered, pouring the drinks. As the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, warming the room, something unexpected happened. The initial awkwardness faded, replaced by genuine conversation. Robert, despite his slurred speech, told stories of his days as a mechanic, his words becoming clearer as his excitement grew. "Had my own garage for 30 years, he said proudly. "Fixed everything from tractors to Cadillacs." Robert could diagnose an engine problem just by listening, Margaret added. "People came from 3 counties over just to have him look at their cars." Keanu leaned forward, genuinely interested. "My first job was working at a bike shop. Nothing as impressive as a garage, but I loved working with my hands." Robert nodded approvingly. "Good honest work. Better than pretending to be other people for a living." His eyes twinkled, showing he meant no offense. Keanu laughed. "You might be right about that." As they talked, Margaret watched her husband come alive in a way she hadn't seen in months. His hands still shook, but his eyes were bright, engaged. When he struggled to find words, Keanu waited patiently, never showing a hint of discomfort or pity. What had begun as a chance encounter was transforming into something none of them could have predicted, a bridge between worlds that seemed entirely separate, but shared more common ground than anyone might have guessed. 2 weeks passed quickly. Margaret found herself checking the calendar every morning, counting down the days until their anniversary. The jewelry store called to let her know the cufflinks were ready, and she arranged to pick them up the following day. What she didn't expect was the text message that arrived that evening from an unknown number. "This is Keanu. Hope it's okay that George gave me your number. Just wanted to check how you and Robert are doing." Margaret stared at her phone in disbelief. Her granddaughter had insisted on getting her a smartphone last Christmas, saying it would help them stay in touch. Margaret had learned to text, slowly typing with one finger, but never imagined she'd be texting with a movie star. She replied simply, "We are well. Robert talks about your visit often. The cufflinks are ready." The anniversary morning dawned bright and clear. Margaret woke early, her heart fluttering with excitement like a schoolgirl's. She made Robert's favorite breakfast, blueberry pancakes with real maple syrup, a luxury they usually saved for special occasions. "Happy anniversary, my love," she said, helping him into his chair at the kitchen table. She placed a small blue box beside his plate. Robert's eyes lit up. "Maggie, you shouldn't have spent the money." "Hush now," she said, kissing his forehead. 60 years deserves something special." His fingers trembled badly that morning, so Margaret opened the box for him. The sapphire cufflinks caught the morning light, throwing tiny blue sparkles across the worn tablecloth. "They're made from my mother's brooch," Margaret explained, watching his face. Robert's eyes filled with tears. "The one you wore when we got married." His voice shook, not just from the Parkinson's. "Maggie, I can't believe you'd give that up for me." "I didn't give it up," she said softly. "I transformed it into something new, just like we've done with our love all these years." Robert reached for her hand, his fingers unsteady but his grip still warm and familiar. "Help me put them on? I want to wear them today." Margaret had just finished fastening the second cufflink when the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone. Their children weren't due until evening for the small celebration dinner they planned. Who on earth could that be? She wondered, making her way to the door. When she opened it, she couldn't believe her eyes. Keanu Reeves stood on their porch, dressed in a simple black suit, holding a small cake box and a bouquet of wildflowers. "Happy anniversary," he said, smiling. "I hope I'm not intruding." Margaret was speechless for a moment. "Not at all," she finally managed. "Please come in. Robert will be so surprised." Robert was indeed surprised, his face breaking into a wide smile when he saw their visitor. "Well, look who's here." The movie star returns. Keanu set the cake on the coffee table and handed the wildflowers to Margaret. "These reminded me of the story you told me about Robert bringing you wildflowers when you were dating." Margaret touched the delicate petals, deeply moved by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. "Thank you. They're beautiful." Robert proudly showed off his new cufflinks. "Look what my Maggie gave me. 60 years and she still surprises me." "They look wonderful," Keanu said. "Perfect for today's celebration." He glanced at Margaret with a small smile, their shared secret about who had actually paid for them remaining unspoken. "But that's not all," Keanu continued, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a cream-colored envelope and handed it to them. "This is my anniversary gift to you both." Margaret opened the envelope, reading the contents with widening eyes. "Robert," she whispered, "it's a 3-day stay at the Ocean View Hotel. That's where we spent our honeymoon. Complete with medical assistance if needed," Keanu added. "I checked with the hotel. They have staff who can help with Robert's needs." Robert shook his head in disbelief. "Why would you do this for us? You barely know us." Keanu sat down across from them, his expression earnest. "In my line of work, I meet thousands of people, but rarely get to know any of them. When I saw Margaret in that jewelry store, something told me to stop and listen. And I'm glad I did." He looked between them both. "Your story, your love, it's real in a way that so many things in my world aren't. I wanted to honor that." The room fell quiet, the only sound the ticking of the old clock that had marked the passing of their 60 years together, now witnessing something none of them could have imagined. A new kind of connection that crossed all the usual boundaries of age, fame, and circumstance. News travels fast in small towns. By the time Margaret and Robert returned from their anniversary trip to the Ocean View Hotel, whispers were already spreading about Keanu Reeves' unexpected connection with the elderly couple. At first, it was just curious glances at the grocery store, neighbors finding excuses to drop by with casseroles and questions barely disguised as friendly conversation. Margaret deflected most inquiries with a gentle smile and a simple, "He's a very kind man who appreciated our story." What no one expected was that this wasn't the end of their connection, but just the beginning. 2 months after their anniversary, Margaret answered a knock at the door to find Keanu standing there, motorcycle helmet in hand, a shy smile on his face. "I was filming nearby," he explained, "and thought I'd stop by to see how you both are doing." Robert was having a good day. His hands were steadier than usual, and his speech clearer. When he spotted the motorcycle parked in their driveway, his eyes lit up. "Used to ride one of those," he said wistfully. "Back when we were first married, Maggie hated it." "Still do," Margaret chimed in, but she was smiling. Keanu glanced between them. "Would you like to go for a short ride, Robert? Just around the block?" Margaret's immediate instinct was to say no. Robert was too frail, it wasn't safe. But the look of longing on her husband's face stopped her. How long had it been since she'd seen that spark in his eyes? "Is that even possible?" she asked hesitantly. Keanu nodded. "I've been thinking about it since my last visit. This bike has a sidecar. Added it last year. It's stable and he'd be secure." That afternoon, neighbors peeked through curtains at the unlikely sight. Robert Wilson, 79 years old with Parkinson's disease, beaming from the sidecar of Keanu Reeves' motorcycle as they slowly circled the block 3 times. Margaret stood on the porch, her heart in her throat, but the joy on Robert's face told her this risk was worth taking. Local teenagers captured the moment on their phones, and by evening, the story had spread far beyond their small town. A reporter called the next day, asking for an interview. "Absolutely not," Margaret said firmly. This isn't about publicity, it's about friendship. And that's exactly what developed over the months that followed. Keanu didn't make a public spectacle of his visits, which came every couple of months when his schedule allowed. Sometimes he brought small gifts, a rare car magazine for Robert, a vintage brooch he'd found at an antique shop that reminded him of Margaret's mother's sapphire. More valuable than the gifts was the time he spent with them, playing checkers with Robert and often losing, listening to Margaret's stories about her nursing days, or sometimes just sitting quietly on their porch as evening fell. "Why us?" Margaret asked him once, as they washed dishes together after dinner. "You must meet thousands of interesting people." Keanu was quiet for a moment, carefully drying a delicate teacup. "When I was growing up, my grandparents gave me stability that I didn't have elsewhere. Being here, it feels like home in a way many places don't." He placed the cup in the cabinet. "And honestly, most people want something from me. You and Robert never did." On Robert's 80th birthday, Keanu helped Margaret organize a small party. He stayed in the background, content to be just another guest rather than the center of attention. But Robert insisted Keanu sit at his right hand at the dinner table. "Family sits together," Robert announced in a rare moment of perfect clarity, his trembling hand resting briefly on Keanu's shoulder. Later that night, after everyone had left and Robert had gone to bed, Margaret found Keanu sitting alone on the porch swing. "He called you family," she said softly, sitting beside him. Keanu nodded, his eyes suspiciously bright in the porch light. "That means more than you know." As the seasons changed and Robert's health slowly declined, their unusual friendship became a quiet cornerstone in all their lives, proof that sometimes the most meaningful connections come from the most unexpected places, bridging different worlds with the simple, powerful truth that everyone needs to belong somewhere, to matter to someone, to find home in each other's hearts.